Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the typical correction that Bitcoin gets early on in the post-halving year. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. It does appear that we are potentially just in the correction that Bitcoin often gets in January of post-halving years. In fact, this time you could argue that the correction actually started in December. So we've talked about this a few times, and as I've said before, right, there's no guarantee that it had to happen. And frankly, you could argue that what has happened so far would hardly even qualify as a correction. From the high, Bitcoin's down about 12 to 13%. Oftentimes, that's just considered a Tuesday, right? But we have talked about this outcome a few times over the last 2 to 3 months. One of the things I mentioned previously was that the first correction after you had this sort of impulsive move higher could come around that January timeframe. In fact, it looks like it potentially started a little bit sooner than that. But the reason we discussed this idea in the first place was because if you go back and you look at what happened in 2017, you will see that Bitcoin also had a correction around this time where it actually went all the way down to its 21-week exponential moving average, or EMA. So about a 30 to 40% correction, right around 35%. In 2021, Bitcoin also had a correction in January. And again, that was about a 31 to 32% correction, and it did not actually make it to the 21-week EMA. In fact, if you were to look at the extension from the 20-week moving average back in 2021, January, you can see that it was still 60% above the 21-week EMA when it actually found sort of a higher low, and then it bounced up even higher as the year went on. But I would say that these sorts of corrections are expected. I mean, we actually, even in 2023, we had several of them. We had this first one right there, 20-something% move down, 22% move down, right? Another 22% drop, right? These were all like 20% drops or so. And then that correction right there, basically a year ago at this time, was also about a 20% drop. Then last year, we said it could evolve into a little bit more than 20%, considering that this might be a quote-unquote mid-cycle top. It ended up being about 34%. So it was a deeper correction than what we had seen in these prior drops. Now, one of the things that happened last year after Bitcoin had this explosive rally was that it then basically went sideways for a while. Now, it doesn't always feel sideways, but at one point, Bitcoin went all the way up here, and then it came all the way back down here. And the market didn't really get moving again until February. And at that, you could argue it was mid-February before it really started to move again. Well, I guess maybe early to mid-February. This was February, the week of February 5th. And you can actually see that Bitcoin had that correction, and then the correction bottomed out the last week of January, right? It was actually the last week of January when the correction ultimately bottomed. It bottomed on a wick that came pretty close to the bull market support band, right? The wick took it down to around 38.5K. The bull market support band at the time, the higher end of it was just below that, like $1,000 or $1,000 to $2,000 below that. So we got pretty close to testing that level. And so you could make the case that it's potentially repeating what happened over here. I also think it's important to look at this stuff not just through the lens of year-to-date ROI, but through the lens of cycle ROI. So if you look at the market cycle ROI, you can actually see the purple line is the current cycle. While this is around the time that Bitcoin started moving up again, last cycle, we have made a lot more of the comparisons to the 2016 cycle. You can see how closely, how closely related they look. They look really, really similar. In that case, you can see that the 2016 cycle also had a correction around this time. So, I mean, it's important to just kind of like have some perspective on that side of the market. Obviously, there's no guarantees of anything in these markets. Obviously, people would like to see a right translated peak where the peak occurs in Q4 of the post-halving year. That's sort of the more optimistic scenario. You could always have left translated cycles where the peak occurs earlier in the year. But we'll have to take it, essentially one step at a time. If you were to look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin, one of the things you'll notice is that just simply looking at 2025 and comparing it to, say, 2017, you'll notice that Bitcoin actually had a correction to start 2017 off, right? In fact, in 2017, Bitcoin initially pumped up about 10%, and then it ultimately dropped 70, to about 23% below the yearly open. And it did so within 10 days. We're currently on day 9. So again, it does give you some perspective on the market. And also you should note that day 10, will correspond to, right, just as the unemployment rate is getting released, right? So do consider that because, again, the cyclical components of Bitcoin obviously are important. And, you can look at year-to-date ROI. You can also look at it compared to 2021 if you want and see how in 2021 Bitcoin initially got to move up and then it came right back down, moved up again, came back down again, and then it kind of bottomed out at the end of January. So this, again, no one has a crystal ball, right? No one knows what the future holds, but it is important to recognize that Bitcoin does tend to get these corrections in January of post-halving years. Sometimes it occurs right when January starts. Other times it might occur a little later on in the month. Last year, we even had a correction in January that occurred a little bit later on in the month. It kind of bottomed out at the end of the month. So you always have to consider that. And there's always something to blame, right? This time we have the long end of the yield curve to blame. Long end's going up. And as I talked about yesterday, we did a really long video on it yesterday. If you just simply look at the 10-year yield and you kind of just compare it to what it did last year, the breakout of the 10-year yield last year also caused Bitcoin to essentially get stuck in traffic on Struggle Street for a little while. Because if you look right here, when the 10-year yield broke out and then back tested the 21-week EMA, if you overlay Bitcoin USD onto that chart, what you'll see is that as the 10-year yield went up right there, Bitcoin was not doing so well. And it wasn't until the 10-year yield topped that Bitcoin really started to pick back up again. Now, of course, you could always get the 10-year yield topping for really bad reasons. Obviously, you could make the argument that it topped over here because Yellen issued shorter duration than what the market was ultimately expecting back then. And so it was bullish for both stocks. It was bullish for both stocks and bonds back then. And it was, right? I mean, we saw TLT go up quite a bit. We also saw stocks go up quite a bit. And the reason is because as the 10-year yield came down, that was a tailwind for risk assets. Now, sometimes the 10-year yield can go down, and it's not a tailwind for risk assets if it's going down for, say, the wrong reason, right? If the economy is really slowing down. But if it's just coming back down because the market just got a little carried away, that can be a tailwind for risk assets. And when that happens, you can see Bitcoin use that as an opportunity to make another move higher. So arguably, the drop by Bitcoin right now could be attributed to the breakout of the 10-year yield. But at the same time, we talked about this idea months ago. And as always, there will always be a narrative that we can assign to any outcome, right? To any outcome. We can always assign a narrative to it. So, I just need to sneeze, but too bad I don't edit my videos, right? But I do think that, we could see it, continue on a little bit longer, obviously, especially if the 10-year yield goes up from here. If we get an idea of how long it went up last time after it tested the 21-week EMA, that might be somewhat insightful. So if we look right here, in July, I guess my computer's struggling a little bit to keep up and to load. But if you look here in July of 2023, one of the things you'll notice is that if we say sort of just take like a date range from there over, the 10-year yield rallied for about 3 to 4 months, right? About 15 weeks or so. We're currently on week 4. So, I mean, it's always possible that the 10-year yield continues to rally beyond January. But if it plays out like 2017, then the 10-year yield would probably top either, probably in January or maybe a little bit later on in Q1. If it falls 2017, it would just top in January, I believe. You can go take a look right now and see here, right, the 10-year yield sort of topped out right there at, sort of in December, and then it had another move up there in March. So it mostly topped around that time, right? Q1 of 2017. So I wouldn't be that surprised to see the 10-year yield top in Q1 of 2025, and by extension, the DXY top in Q1 of 2025. But I would think that is the narrative to be assigned to the sort of the lackluster price action by Bitcoin recently. And the other thing, to consider is that, obviously the more optimistic scenario is that Bitcoin just kind of does what it did last year, where it just sort of goes sideways, maybe wicks down a little bit as the bull market sweeping comes up. That's a more optimistic scenario. It is possible to get a deeper drop where it backtests that, sort of the breakout, right? You guys remember this mid-cycle top over here, and then Bitcoin put in lower highs for about half a year. We said that was likely going to happen, right? About 6 months of lower highs. And, it is always possible for Bitcoin to backtest that, right? It doesn't have to be the most likely outcome that you have to consider, but it is a possibility to at least consider, because and it doesn't have to happen immediately, but you have to remember that there are oftentimes in post-halving years, there can be a lot more volatility. Even in 2021, at one point, we got a 56% correction. In 2017, we got a, right here. Well, I guess that was a little bit later on. But right, when the top occurred in 2017, right, when the top occurred, almost immediately there was like a 45% correction. And if you go earlier in 2017, there were plenty of 40% drops, right? So, volatility can certainly pick up in post-halving years. So don't shy away from it. Don't ignore it. I would just be open-minded to those outcomes. And if they happen, hopefully Bitcoin can bounce off of that level and continue on. But that's essentially what I wanted to talk about today. We are, arguably in just sort of the typical January of the post-halving year correction. The glass half full approach would be to look at monthly candles and say, what correction? Right? I mean, hell, January is still green at this point, which is why I think one of the key things to take away from this is that there is a possibility that the market just sort of decided to front run the typical correction and already started to drop before January even occurred. But I'll tell you what, guys. I mean, you can make the comparisons to 2017. We can make the comparisons to 2021. But if I'm being honest, the thing it looks the most similar to continues to just be 2023, right? Where, you also had a wick up in early January and then a move down. We had a wick up. It was a lower high, but still, technically, we wicked up, and then now we're coming back down. So again, it really does remind me a lot of what happened last year around the same time. So anyways, we'll take it one day at a time. Obviously, as the labor market data comes in over the next couple of days, we'll try to compile that and make a video and talk about the implications for Bitcoin. We'll see where it comes in. But again, thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. But again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.